Hello, my name is Garrod O'Rian and I'm a post-primary teacher. School uniforms have become the norm in Ireland since the 1980s, but there is a growing public discussion as to why we think it is necessary that our children spend almost every day of their childhood, from 4 years of age to 18, in uniforms. In this presentation, I will look at the historical reasons for this, how it came about, how they are an expression of an oppressive institutional culture, and the impact they have on schools, teachers and students. I'm going to explain why I think that the school policies and rules on uniforms can in fact constitute a form of institutional bullying that needs to be addressed. Of course, most teachers nowadays want to have good interpersonal relationships with their students. They want to have a happy, positive atmosphere in their classrooms. They don't want to be in conflict with their students, enforcing rules that belong in the 1950s, making them wear clothes they don't like or feel comfortable in. There is a fundamental contradiction between an archaic institutional culture of uniformity that is stuck in a time warp and a modern teaching culture that is based on cooperation, pastoral care, creating a safe environment where students can be themselves, respecting diversity, encouraging freedom of expression and supportive communication. This puts many teachers in an invidious position when they are expected to implement arbitrary rules about what students are wearing, rules that many of them don't really believe in, and that can create an oppressive culture in which bullying thrives. Bullying is a big problem in Irish schools. 1 in 4 students report having been bullied recently. In January 2024, Minister Norma Foley announced that schools would be required to collect data on all incidents of bullying. This is part of a brilliant initiative called Cináltas, which aims to tackle the problem. Let's look briefly now at what bullying is. Bullying is targeted, repeated behaviour that causes physical, emotional or psychological harm. It includes an imbalance of power in relationships. What better example in terms of an imbalance of power is the relationship between students and teachers? There is an assumption that bullying only happens on an individual level, student on student, or that individual rogue teachers can be bullies. This ignores the potential for institutional bullying, which occurs when the institutionally sanctioned policies and practices are oppressive and harmful to children. Are school policies and rules in relation to uniforms oppressive? Here's an example of a school policy. On their website, this school thanks people for their support in implementing their school shoe policy and promises to continue to monitor this in the coming year. With limited time and resources, should monitoring students' shoes really be such a priority in a school? And of course, if you have policies and rules, you have to enforce them. And how do you do that? What chilling effect do these strategies have on students, most of whom don't want to be hassled or punished or shamed by teachers? Most eventually comply and over the years become institutionalized. For most of the 20th century, corporal punishment was viewed as very acceptable and even necessary in Irish schools. It was eventually banned in 1982, but as this Irish Times report showed, it is still a very raw nerve for many people who experienced it. But it wasn't abolished without a fight. Let's listen to a piece from the RTE archive. It was 1974 and Tony Kinsella was a 19-year-old student leader. It shows how, even for something so blatantly wrong in our eyes nowadays, a strong campaign was necessary to stop teachers beating students with, among other things, branches of trees.
In second level schools, in some form, 84% use corporal punishment as a method of discipline. Whether that's the official school policy or simply individual teachers, we couldn't determine.
What is the main method of corporal punishment that is used?
Far and away the main method is the leather strap, but one finds canes, rulers, T-squares, furniture legs, tree branches, etc. as other methods.
Well,
And on occasion, actual physical assault such as slaps, punches, etc.
there doesn't seem to be any great outcry for the abolition of corporal punishment. Why have you started this campaign now?
On the contrary, we feel there's a great latent hostility amongst the community to corporal punishment. Mr. Burke, in a newspaper interview in June, said that he didn't feel corporal punishment was altogether wrong, and this caused a tremendous outcry both in the media and from individuals. We feel that there is a general hostility to it in our schools.
What alternative do you suggest for corporal punishment?
In the short term, the obvious alternative is student involvement in their own discipline through some form of democratic structures in the schools. In the longer term, the continental system of providing student privileges and withdrawing them as methods of discipline would seem to be the best. Unfortunately, in most schools at the moment, there aren't any student privileges to be withdrawn.
Yes, corporal punishment was abolished in 1982, but the almost militaristic culture that spawned it has deep roots and was not dealt with. In the educational landscape, the focus is on control and huge value is placed on conformity. It is so endemic that it is invisible. Andre Spicer is Professor of Organisational Behaviour in London University. In an article in The Guardian in September 2023, he explains how after the abolition of corporal punishment in the UK in the 1980s, there was a panic in schools about how they were going to control students. And he explains how uniforms became the focus. Many schools introduced uniforms at this time, and others became stricter on them. This happened in Ireland too. So what impact has this continuation of the old culture of control had in Irish schools? Let's look first of all at the impact on the type of education our students are getting. Andreas Schleicher, who is Director of Education in the OECD, reviewed the post-primary education system in Ireland and reported in 2021 that we have a system that is industrial in its outlook and good at producing second-class robots. That is, obedient people who do what you tell them but can't think for themselves, which is not what we need in the 21st century. It is my contention that uniforms are the clearest symptom of an Irish school culture which overvalues conformity at the expense of self-expression. In effect, they give a clear subliminal signal to students that you cannot be yourself in school. They thereby devalue the place of creative thinking and problem solving in the place that is, in theory, supposed to nurture them. A second potential impact is institutionalized bullying. Remember, a systemic focus on control and conformity has to be enforced. We have seen how endemic physical violence was in Irish schools and that uniforms have taken the place of corporal punishment as the preferred tool of control. This, at the very least, has the potential to constitute institutional bullying. So coming back to Minister Foley's initiative on collecting data, wouldn't it make sense to examine institutional bullying too, to check if it is a reality? Most schools nowadays are using IT systems that are already generating interesting data relevant to what we are talking about. So let those IT systems be developed and let the department process it and publish it and see what it throws up. This slide shows the top 5 so-called negative behaviours in a school. They show nearly half of all the so-called negative behaviours relate to what the students are wearing. Of course, students making a choice as to what they wear on any given day is not a negative behaviour. It's a positive, normal decision made by most human beings. So is there really a link between uniforms and bullying? Let's look at a European study by Statista in 2018. It examines instances of recently reported bullying by country and prevalence of uniforms. 40 countries in the European continent were studied. This chart shows whether the countries have uniforms in most schools or not, and how prevalent bullying is. Those in green are countries where there are generally no uniforms, red where most schools have uniforms, and yellow where many schools have uniforms. So the first thing to note is that most countries, 32 out of 40, don't have uniforms, and those who have uniforms are all in the top half in terms of instances of bullying. Here are the top 5. 3 of them, Russia, Latvia and Malta, are countries where uniforms are the norm. At first glance, Ireland doesn't compare too badly in mid-table, but if we look more closely, we see a number of things. Firstly, those towards the top of the table, with the red dots, are all former members of the USSR with its repressive totalitarian history. Secondly, the countries of the EU, or those culturally aligned with the EU, with the blue dots, tend to have less bullying. Thirdly, none of the countries in the lower half have uniforms as the norm. When we take out the former totalitarian countries of the USSR, we see the pattern more clearly. The only 3 countries with school uniforms are in the top 5. Malta at number 1, the UK at number 2, and Ireland at number 5. Interestingly, Ireland and Malta have a couple of things in common. Both have a recent history of a church-dominated school system, and both are former colonies of the UK, the inventor of school uniforms. Now, either this is a remarkable coincidence, or there is a link between countries with a history of repressive cultures, be it political or religious, and school uniforms. So, contrary to the impression people in Ireland might have, putting children into uniforms for most every day of their childhood is far from normal and offers no protection from bullying. In fact, we have seen that it is quite the opposite. Let's do a quick tour of the EU. See if you can spot who stands out. There are approximately 109 million school children in the EU. More than 108 million of them live in countries where wearing your own clothes to school is the norm. Less than 1 million live in Ireland and Malta, where uniforms are the norm. Yet, because we see uniforms all the time, many of us find it hard to imagine or consider school without them. But we are the outliers. In light of the Department of Education's very welcome initiative on data collection on individual bullying, It makes sense to also address the potential for institutional bullying and to therefore, number one, expand the collection of data to include data on the enforcement of school uniform rules and other policies. Number two, to give a clear message to schools that recognises the right of children to be free from reprimands and other punishments which are based on the clothes they are wearing. And number three, to acknowledge that wearing comfortable clothes is not a form of misbehaviour and advise schools to no longer deal with it under school codes of behaviour. Number four, to assert that there is no sound educational, social, financial, safety, anti-bullying or equality case to support obligatory uniforms. Number five, to acknowledge that punishing children because of what they are wearing in school can have a chilling psychological effect on them. And finally, number six, to recommend to new schools to explore non-uniform policies and to existing schools to have non-uniform trials of a minimum of 6 months. As teachers and parents, we can be blind to the negative educational and psychological effects of uniforms and how they can contribute to an oppressive environment where students survive despite them rather than because of them. Bullies thrive in oppressive regimes. Our blindness through familiarity to the oppressive institutional culture which favours uniforms will have to change if bullying is to be fully tackled in schools. A much more positive, healthy and natural alternative exists. Colm O'Connor, a post-primary principal in County Cork, draws our attention to the benefits of allowing students be themselves and be comfortable in school. He says it brings light and levity to the classrooms and corridors. Wouldn't we all love that, for ourselves and for our children? I hope you found this presentation of interest. Thank you.